Welcome to the World Forest Report. I'm Dean Val here with Dean Kevin. We will be reporting on the fires, and I'm going to talk a little bit about geoengineering of the weather, which has a lot to do with the fires since they're dumping aluminum and other chemicals and metallics and sources of fires. Basically they enhance the fires when these things are in the soil. So I'm going to play a little bit of the dimming here today. Start off. This is from Dane Wigington's geoengineeringwatch.org website. It's a documentary he put out a few months ago. I found out the director there was some kind of accident. He mysteriously died just before the documentary came out. So this is the danger everybody's in when they're whistleblowing or talking about what's really happening. But he did get the documentary out. It's called The Dimming, and it's about geoengineering of the weather.
Perhaps the greatest lie ever perpetrated on populations all over the world is the condensation trail lie. What we're seeing in our skies is not condensation. It's sprayed particulate dispersions with very few exceptions.
They shouldn't be there. Jet engines burn clean. So if there's anything coming out of them, it's an additive.
They're absolutely not contrails. Contrails do not linger, dissipate, and go into cloud coverage, period, in the report.
And I kept saying to people, what is this? Because now the sky is no longer blue, it's starting to turn gray. And what I found was kind of like it was not socially acceptable. We're all gonna pretend this is not really happening. And I thought, oh, this is very bad.
Most are unfamiliar with a science term called global dimming. That term refers to the amount of direct sunlight that no longer reaches the surface of the planet due to light scattering particles that are building up in the atmosphere. And although many of these particles are from industrialized pollution, the larger majority are from the ongoing climate engineering solar radiation management operations. This engine, a high bypass turbofan jet engine, this is the engine that is on all military tankers and all commercial carriers, is in essence a jet-powered fan. 90% of the air that moves through this engine is non-combusted. This engine by design is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. And again, we have film footage of aircraft flying at altitude with nozzles visible, turning on and off. That is the end of the argument. Since even before man could fly, there was an effort to try to modify the weather. We have weather modification patents going back 100 years plus.
These are historical films of what can be done with a biplane, a small biplane that carries a very small payload. And that much can be done. How much more can a fully loaded military tanker, KC-10, KC-135, C-17 Globemaster, how much more material can they put in the air? About 500 times more with a single tanker.
In regard to the condensation trail narrative, many refer back to the trails left by World War II bombers as proof that we are only seeing condensation trails in our skies. But geoengineeringwatch.org found on military archives film footage, which we posted, of World War II B-17s at altitude turning off a sprayed dispersion. We know that climate engineering was deployed immediately after World War II, so testing was absolutely ongoing. Clearly, these bombers were used for beta testing. Film footage proves it.
Weather was a weapon used over Vietnam. Would you expect that to be then deleted from the availability? No. To continue to expand the scientific aspects of it, to have it available in your portfolio of weapons, would be a natural process. Therefore, should you expect that it is available on demand to have the ability to modify weather? Absolutely, within this country and others.
Climate engineering is the crown jewel of the military-industrial complex. Climate engineering has been used to destabilize and topple nations all over the globe, facilitating military occupations by hostile countries like the US. We know that some of these countries are having their precipitation cut off because they have stated so on the floor of the UN, like the president of Iran stating emphatically that NATO weather modification programs were cutting off the precipitation to Iran, but US media never covered it.
We have an economic model operating globally, which is operating based on covert force. And I have very serious questions after watching the financial patterns as to whether that financial force or that force includes weather warfare.
People were coming to me, telling me about this. So because of that, I went to the government in Ottawa under Freedom of Information. It was a 40-page report, of which half the pages were completely blank, and the other half had a lot of blank outs. But there was sufficient information to tell me that, yeah, they're aware. They call it geoengineering.
One of the big problems is that when we find some new technology, we get all excited by it, by the potential benefits of that technology, and often implement it and use the technology before we have any idea of the negative effects.
Shouldn't it be considered that every breath we take is laden with highly toxic particles that are wreaking havoc in our own bodies? Particles that aren't being reported by any air quality testing systems. Any official air quality testing are looking for PM10 or PM2.5, 2.5 microns at best. The climate engineering nanoparticulates are exponentially smaller. They go virtually unreported.
These nanomaterials generate reactive oxygen species in biological materials, damage tissue, lead to advanced aging, cause cancer, causative agents of dementia. So, yeah, we might think that we're doing something positive for humanity to save our species, but we're also poisoning ourselves.
Eventually, with the team that we formed at geoengineeringwatch.org, we were able to acquire a NOAA flying lab. We were able to test at altitude to confirm the elements that were showing up at the surface.
Our intention was to do a point-to-point sampling mission. We could see these obvious patterns that were being laid out in the sky. We were really thankful for the opportunity to be able to get up to altitude. And on the return mission, we noticed that that cloud layer had descended. And we sampled below the cloud layer, we sampled through that confluent layer and above it.
We found exactly the same elements listed in climate engineering patents, the same elements we found on countless surface tests of precipitation from all over the globe. Governments all over the globe and the entire climate science community are telling the population urgently that climate engineering operations, solar radiation management operations need to be immediately deployed to try to mitigate the warming of our planet, to try to preserve what's left of its life support systems. And yet when the public, those that are awake, try to bring to the attention of academia and elected officials that we see climate engineering already being conducted in our skies all over the globe. It's already been deployed. Lab tests prove it. Film footage proves it. Documents prove it. And yet we have the continued denial from the climate science community and official agencies telling us that we're not really seeing what we're seeing in the skies. They tell us if climate engineering were deployed, it would look exactly like what we're seeing in our skies. But then again, they tell us that we're not really seeing what we are actually seeing. The paradox is the more the climate engineers spray the planet, destroy the ozone layer, disrupt the hydrological cycle, and increase the overall warming of the planet, the more they feel they have to ramp these programs up to try to mitigate some of the damage that these programs have done in the first place. That is the true definition of insanity.
As a society, we are like a freight train heading for a broken bridge that is just a few years away from us. And I think people don't understand the exponential increase of toxicity in the environment.
These operations should be considered the most insane endeavor ever deployed by the human race. These operations are systematically derailing all of Earth's life support systems in the attempt to blot out the sun. The myopic, short-term objective of trying to cool the planet while worsening the overall warming. The climate engineers, if these operations are allowed to continue, are pounding the nails into our collective coffins.
From a scientific perspective, and what we know about nanomaterials and their effect on human health and the environment, this is a serious problem. And it really does warrant further scientific investigation.
We need the answers to get to the bottom of this national security problem.
If populations around the globe find out what has been done to them by their governments without their knowledge or their consent, there will be a shockwave around the globe that cannot be contained by the criminal governments that have now taken control of our planet and civilizations all over the world.
Just bringing transparency will shift so many things that it will make it extremely difficult, because you cannot manage an entire planet with overt force, only with covert force. If we bring transparency to who it is in the covert force, it shifts everything.
Look at your own health and you know what is going on. And if you love your children, join us in fighting what we need to fight. This is a just fight, it's the right fight, it's the right cause.
And if the climate engineering operations, which are derailing Earth's life support systems, are not immediately exposed and halted, all other challenges for the human race become moot, because the planet will no longer support life. We are in completely uncharted territory. Virtually the entire web of life is being systematically contaminated and decimated by the ongoing climate engineering operations, on top of all other forms of human activity or anthropogenic activity that are wreaking havoc in the web of life. Climate engineering, mathematically, statistically speaking, is the single greatest and most immediate threat we collectively face, short of nuclear cataclysm.
Sounds like pure science fiction, but there is a growing underground movement of people who believe that our harsh drought is part of a government conspiracy.
Here, outlandish ideas like weather warfare and climate engineering, in other words, weather control, are accepted as basic fact.
Climate engineering is the greatest single assault on the environment ever launched by humanity, without question.
Dane Wigington, lead researcher for Geoengineering Watch, is sounding the alarm. Climate engineering, they say, is to blame for the harshest recorded drought in California history. Dane is used to skeptics. He once was one himself.
Talk is cheap for those that haven't investigated. I didn't want to believe this either.
His background is in solar power, but he started investigating on his own about a decade ago after becoming suspicious something was partially blocking the sun's energy from reaching his solar home.
I grew up in Southern California, choking in a sea of smog. None of the adults around me seemed concerned about the conditions, but for me, life in the toxic murk was intolerable. I have always fully recognized the immense damage being inflicted on the planet by countless forms of human activity. I lectured on anthropogenic global warming. I dreamt of clean air and blue skies. I dreamt of living in untainted wilderness, off the grid. I dreamt of planting trees and watching them grow and thrive. I dreamt of coexisting with the wild inhabitants of the forest. I finally made it to the serene setting I had craved for so long, a remote forested mountaintop in Northern California. But the dream soon turned to a nightmare. When I began to lose significant amounts of my solar power uptake from my off-grid wilderness home, I knew something was radically wrong. We are officially told that the aircraft-emitted trails in our skies that linger, spread, and sometimes cover the entire horizon are just condensation. But the condensation trail narrative is perhaps the greatest lie ever perpetrated on populations all over the world. It is not possible for condensation to block at times 60, 70, even 80% of my solar power uptake. I began to research the issue of geoengineering, aka climate engineering, programs that governments around the globe and in climate science communities have told us are only proposals. Yet, there they were in the skies above me. Even today, we are being told, falsely, by the climate science community that we have one final card to play to try to avert total climate collapse, total planetary meltdown, but this is in fact a lie. Climate engineering, weather modification patents go back more than 100 years, but all available data indicates that programs were first deployed at scale immediately after World War II and deployed over the polar regions in the attempt to increase the size of the polar ice packs and thus try to regulate Earth's temperatures.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Numerous government documents posted at geoengineeringwatch.org, some as much as 800 pages long, prove that global governments, even governments that the public perceives as being adversarial, are in fact colluding and cooperating on the climate engineering issue due to the cross-border ramifications. You can't climate engineer over your own country without affecting the entire planet. They are all working together on these issues, and other governments around the globe are either actively or passively cooperating.
Is the government experimenting with our weather? People say the government is up there in airplanes spraying all kinds of chemicals to change or manipulate the weather. It is called geoengineering, fighting global warming by putting a chemical dust in the atmosphere and reflecting harmful radiation back into space.
You could use barium oxide, for example, which makes big fluffy clouds. You could use tiny little bits of aluminum, which is benign in the environment, and essentially manage the climate.
There are 172 bills before the U.S. Senate right now calling for more weather modification programs.
A Weather Modification Act calling for research in, quote, attempting to change or control by artificial methods the natural development of atmospheric cloud forms.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it.
There is a line of research on what's called geoengineering, which are various techniques that would delay the heating to buy us 20 or 30 years to get our act together.
The stated goal of some of the world's most recognized geoengineers, like Dr. David Keith and Dr. Ken Caldera, is to put 10 to 20 million tons of nanoparticulates into global skies annually. That's an inconceivable amount of material. This material is on top of industrialized pollution.
Right? This is about how we engineer the planet. It's about the fact, an uncomfortable fact, but it is a fact, that we have the technical ability to do this. They are all fast acting, they are cheap, and they are fundamentally imperfect. There are problems of how you control something where an individual country can have tremendous leverage over the whole planet's climate, and where there are winners and losers in ways that really could be unpredictable. And I mean, not to frighten you, but I think you can imagine scenarios that lead to war.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection.
There's all sorts of ways you could do this, but the standard idea has always been spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up.
The example many people cite was when the Mount Pinatubo volcano exploded. And all of this ash went into the air and had a cooling effect on the Earth.
And so people have long proposed since the mid-60s that you could artificially add dust to the stratosphere and cool the planet. Not that this would be a good solution for global warming, it would not. But it does show the way we're steadily developing the powers to manipulate the planet with comparative ease.
That sulfur in the lower atmosphere is masking some of the climate warming from CO2. So
is this the global dimming or something?
Yeah.
Their leading idea is basically to emulate what big volcanoes do, put material in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight.
So the problem is the following. If you add SO2 to the stratosphere, SO2 doesn't condense. So you might want to put alumina in. Alumina has a very high initial refraction. It's very small. It doesn't coagulate. And you could engineer particles that have particular properties. You can get them above the stratosphere. You can concentrate particles near the poles. Costs are so cheap that the richest people on the planet could perhaps afford to buy an ice age. It's extraordinarily cheap. I knew it was cheap when I found that they were quoting me in tons. It's also true that particles, as they get bigger, fall out a lot faster. We sort of step back and think, okay, well, how would you actually make particles in the stratosphere? This is really engineering now. If it was aerosols in the stratosphere, it would likely be put there by airplanes. Start with a fleet of just 2 or 3 kind of modified business jets. The basic idea is that if you let a plume off in an aircraft by just changing some little details, you can actually get much smaller particle size distributions by doing this kind of spraying. So there are all sorts of side effects. I'll get to them in a second, but if you put sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, for example, you could deplete stratospheric ozone. Smaller size means more surface area, but more surface area means less ozone.
Okay, I'll end there 20 minutes. We'll do 20 minutes each time, but I just wanted to give you a taste of this and how these Frankenstein scientists are just, if they can, they'll do it, even if it's destructive and it's harmful, just because they can do it, they're doing it, spraying all these poisons in the air. And it's just time for people to wake up. There's not much time left, really. So this is one major part of the cause of the fires, these aluminum particulates in the soil igniting, when the lasers, directed energy weapons hit them. And it's just really a flammable material, these metallics in the soil, and it's just causing these fires to go out of control, and then they harp the winds, and these winds can go like, they can carry the fire really, really fast. These can carry it through the environment quickly and cause a lot of destruction. So we're just making people aware here, helping people become more aware of what's going on. But this is a big part of the challenges we have is the geoengineering of the weather here. So that's something I wanted to share today, Kevin.
Yeah, because I mentioned on another show about how when they were activating 5G grids in certain countries, there was phenomena where individuals were spontaneously combusting and bursting into flame. And it's very likely it's linked to this, because obviously all the particulate matter coming down in the chemtrails is obviously very flammable, which is causing the fires as they hit it with their lasers. But also this very flammable, ignitable material is also present in every body vehicle as well. And it seems that when they activate 5G, I'm not even sure they may have even intended for that to happen, or maybe they did, but it does seem a possibility that when they do that is that you do have this phenomena where people's bodies can burst into flame, and it does look like a spontaneous combustion event. And there's always a lot of this was always something that had happened and had been recorded for a number of years now. So I remember going back years and years and years back into looking at reports back to the 60s and 50s and even before that there has been cases of spontaneous human combustion for probably for as long as there have been humans, and it was never determined as to what had caused that. But it's very possible it may be linked to this, because if they've been if they've been testing this technology, where it's very likely that a lot of people had been inadvertently caught up in their testing and been possibly either directed test subjects, or perhaps, as I said, just in the wrong place at the wrong time, because there was never ever an explanation given that was plausible as to why spontaneous combustion occurred. And it's very likely it's due to all the stuff they're dumping in the atmosphere, which is very flammable, and then a certain thing may trigger it, and then there you have the body going up in flames. But it's quite interesting, because I don't think the chemtrails were known of in the alternative media until probably around the turn of the millennium. I mean, they always had been going on, but I don't think it was very widely known. But again, when in regards to predictive programming, there were a lot of series and movies that came out around the 90s which depicted planes dumping certain chemicals and properties into the atmosphere and causing various effects. I remember one specifically was the series called The X-Files, and during one of the earlier series, there was actually a show where there was planes flying over and releasing a lot of matter into the atmosphere, and Mulder went to investigate because he discovered that in this particular town, everybody was having hallucinations, and it was causing them to go crazy and attack people and just generally be uncharacteristic in their behaviour and very violently and become very violent and such. And so he went to investigate and discovered these planes dumping this matter in the atmosphere. And this was before, and this X-File episode was before chemtrails were widely known anywhere or even mentioned of. And then what happened then, as the planes dumped this material, as individuals then watched the television, there were signals coming through the televisions, which would be subliminal, would be beyond the threshold of what they can actually perceive through the senses, but still nevertheless going into the subconscious, which then sort of combined with what the planes were dumping and caused people to have hallucinations, which caused them to become very violent. And so it, I mean, if you sort of that, and again, at the time when the X-File episode came out, this was before the advent of mobile phones and 5G, 4G, or any type of G for that matter. But nevertheless, it was it was certainly implanting the notion that through technology, can it activate this material that is being dumped by the planes, which will then be obviously have very adverse and various effects on humanity. And it did suggest the possibility of hallucinations to the extent that could drive people into sort of crazed rages. And I often wonder where you see these spontaneous individuals suddenly attacking people, and a lot of the alternative media people will say they've been brainwashed, they've been mind controlled, and through various techniques. And this may well be another means by which they can do it, perhaps, that with all this material in the body, all this nano particulate matter, that if they can directly target an individual and perhaps transmit information through their cell phones, they can actually program them that way. Because when it comes to hallucinations, I mean, all they're really doing is they're interfering with your decoding apparatus of your physical vehicle, that makes it so that you can see that which the decoding apparatus for your physical body was not designed to perceive, because obviously your physical body apparatus is designed for the physical level that it perceives. And so, and if they can interfere with that decoding apparatus, they can possibly implant imagery or such that no one else can see but you, and such hallucinations, because in the X-Files series, the individuals were getting all these curious messages on various technical devices that were basically, as I remember, they were triggering them based on their fears. And whereas one lady, for example, who was terrified of being raped, and she went into a car mechanics studio, and every sort of display panel would pop up with the words, that man over there is going to rape you, and constantly. And so it drove her to the point of sort of almost insanity. And in the end, when one individual in the car mechanic place approached her to ask if she required assistance, she just grabbed hold of a hammer and smashed his head in, because she had been brought to that point of sort of neurosis because of all these messages that were appearing that caused her to do that. And so it's be very interesting as they continue to do this, the extent of which, I mean, probably it's happening now with people having sort of various hallucinations, and it certainly ties in with the sort of overall mind control of humanity, I think, and it's certainly warping behaviour, because more and more in recent times we're seeing more and more very aberrant and very extreme examples of behaviour that just doesn't make sense. You know, with the various rapes and murders and such increasing sort of almost on a daily basis now. So I think it's all linked into that. I think on the Max Egan site, he generally puts up a lot of videos where it displays people showing very unusual behaviour, and some of the things these people are doing just don't make sense whatsoever. It's almost as like they've been switched off, and well, who knows what's motivating their behaviour? But there was individuals just stripping naked and just walking down the street and standing in front of buses and just randomly jumping into fountains and swimming around them. And there was one man who suddenly took it upon himself to walk through the train station and just take a dump in one of the buckets that one of the cleaners was using to clean the walkways with, and he seemed bewildered when people were challenging him, as though it was, for him, it was perfectly normal behaviour.
Yeah, we're very fragile and vulnerable here with our minds and what could be done to the minds. That's why we encourage people to become more aware, because that it's then another viewpoint beyond what the mind registers here. The awareness sees more, you could say, of what's going on, and it's just better for your survival than relying on your mind, which a lot of people have been marketed to think that if you're smart, if you know things, you're going to be okay. But really, the awareness is where it's at. So we encourage people to look beyond what they know and what they think they know to their awareness, and that's what part of this show is about, is to help people become more aware, because it's in your awareness, that's where your survival is best. So thank you, Kevin, that's good.
Yeah, because the problem is if individuals do stay with their personal self and their consciousness is being more and more controlled externally of their free will, of their own free will decision as to the ideas they generate within it. But then you could also argue that through the subconscious, the overall consciousness is generally controlled and managed and has been manipulated and moulded by the controllers anyway. So in a sense, you can say that with most individuals, if they're one-dimensional and personal self-immersed, practically everything of their consciousness is controlled anyway. It has been managed and moulded according to the controller's design. So very little of their own of their thoughts will actually be theirs, but more routine thoughts of the consciousness that has been managed, manipulated, and moulded and designed by the controllers. But now more so than ever, they're slowly wresting even more control of the consciousness into their own hands through technological means. Through the chemtrails, which are all part of the eventual robotization of the human race, in which eventually, when they throw the 5G switches, then everyone becomes robotized. They're connected through the technology, in which they will. It's almost as though you have had control of your own computer taken from you, and you're almost a back passenger in your own consciousness, as it were. So now more than ever would be a good time to learn to step beyond the personal self, connect with the real awareness, because regardless of the extent to which your consciousness is controlled, your real awareness is aside from it and is untouchable, therefore, by anything that's happening in creation. And so even if your consciousness was completely controlled and you had no personal free will managing of your own thought processes, you could still tap into your real awareness. And it would be quite strange, really, because if someone's constantly triggering your mind and emotions, it'd almost be like you'd be sitting in front of your computer screen while somebody else is using your equipment, almost like you're watching other people go through websites and sites and things like that. And so it'd be quite strange, almost being a passenger in your own consciousness, but at least you wouldn't be locked into it and you'd be aside from it and still with your real awareness. And I would have suggested, if it got to that point and you're on your awareness process and you discovered that your consciousness was completely controlled at that point, particularly if the consciousness, the vast majority, is also controlled to that extent, that it probably wouldn't make any sense to remain in this particular physical level position, because at that point, if people hadn't got on their awareness process, they're not likely to at that point, because it's the personal self that must free will decide to do so. If someone else has control of your personal self vehicle, well, they're not going to install ideas in your consciousness to motivate you to want to become more aware, are they? Because obviously any awareness is undermining of their control system as you step aside from the consciousness, which through the agreements to the controllers supports them and their controlling positions. And so, and obviously at that point, then if everything comes to that extent, then the vast majority will be unreachable, and also it will be very difficult. I mean, it would be rather difficult, I would imagine, to even maintain, even if you did have recognition of your real awareness, it would be virtually impossible to maintain your nowness position, which is your state of real awareness being, because obviously if you activate anything through the personal self, that instantly will remove you from this nowness real awareness position, because obviously any idea you create, you then are the effects of, and so that would have you moved from this nowness position where you're not creating anything. If something is constantly triggering your personal self and constantly creating these ideas absent of your free will choice to do so, then it's very likely you may find it would be virtually impossible to maintain this nowness real awareness state. And I had real side experience where experience is a series, and where it showed me that this potentiality, and also the possibility that if this happens, it struck me, if it got that far, that the real awareness will pull the plug, as it were. It will basically shut down its personal self and cause a transition, because it seems that the real awareness, the guide's life would recognise that the process of awareness would have been curtailed and prevented from being able to continue, because the personal self, which always must free will to decide to continue with the process, has been completely usurped and taken control of. So at that point, I saw a series of experiences which suggested those on their awareness process, if they were still here and this event took place where the entire human race was robotized, including their body vehicles, and controlled to that extent, that yes, they have that real awareness position, but while they're locked into that consciousness, which is completely controlled, there's no way they can access it in that position. And so it was almost as though all the awareness people had instantly transitioned, and then they were positioned according to their awareness process, what they recognized and what made the position that made most sense for them to be in according to their awareness. And so it'd be interesting to see how things transpire.
Very well explained. Thank you.
I've got a whole series of reports which probably covers all the stuff that's happened in Brazil in recent times. There's a series of 3 articles, so I'll go through that. It's an overview of everything that's happened with Brazil over the last 2 years. It sort of put it all together, really. So I thought it was. So I'll just read through all these. So the source of this information was from Reuters. The following information was sourced from Reuters. August the 13th. Deforestation in Brazil's Amazon rainforest fell 10% in July from a year earlier, after 4 straight monthly increases, preliminary data showed on Friday, but destruction remains far higher than before President Jair Bolsonaro took office. Cleared forest in the month of July totaled 1,498 square kilometers, 578 square miles, nearly twice the size of New York City, according to government space research agency INPE. From January to July, deforestation in the Amazon was up 7.8% from a year ago to 5,108 square kilometers, INPE data showed. Last year, deforestation hit a 12-year high under far-right President Bolsonaro, who has weakened environmental enforcement and called for mining and commercial farming in protected areas of the rainforest. In June, Bolsonaro again dispatched the military to protect the forest, repeating an intermittent strategy that has failed to reduce destruction to levels seen before he took office in 2019. Bolsonaro's office did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the latest deforestation data. The latest INPE figures cap the period for Brazil's official annual deforestation records, measured from August 2020 to July 2021, to minimize interference from cloud cover. For the 12 months through July, the preliminary data shows a 4.6% decrease in deforestation. Scientists say a decrease in the preliminary numbers generally means there will be a decrease in the final, more accurate measure known as PRODES. Vice President Hamilton Morale, who leads the government's Amazon policy, said last week that the figures are now headed in the right direction. The cycle ended on July the 31st. I think it will be in the range of 4% to 5%, a very small reduction, very inadequate, but it's on a track, Morale told reporters. But researchers say the destruction is still far higher than before Bolsonaro took office, and a single-digit decrease does little to change the vast environmental impact. The Amazon is considered a vital bulwark against climate change, and its destruction is the top source of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions. October the 8th. Deforestation in Brazil's Amazon rainforest rose slightly in September from a year ago. Preliminary satellite data showed on Friday, as President Jair Bolsonaro struggles to deliver on a pledge to eliminate illegal forest clearing. The data from National Space Research Agency, INPE, showed about 985 square kilometers, 280 square miles of forest were cleared last month, 2% more than in September 2020. From January to September, deforestation edged down less than 1% to about 7,011 square kilometers, an area almost 9 times the size of New York City. Brazil's Vice President Hamilton Morale used old data on Friday to argue that his government was successfully combating deforestation. He pointed to preliminary data showing deforestation fell 5% between August 2020 and July 2021, highlighting an improvement first reported in August. Bolsonaro has been severely criticized by environmental activists and some world leaders for the rise in deforestation during his presidency to a level not seen in over a decade. His calls for more farming and mining in the Amazon have emboldened illegal loggers and invaders of protected lands. The following information was sourced from Reuters, March the 24th. 2 years ago, the Amazon was aflame, ravaged by arsonists and loggers. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro went to war. Air Force C-130 aircraft spewed water and flame retardant over the burning jungle. The effort, in August 2019, launched a new and unprecedented military deployment to quell fires in the world's largest rainforest. He called it Operation Green Brazil. I am authorizing an operation to guarantee law and order, said Bolsonaro, the far-right president and former paratrooper, announcing the operation. The armed forces, they readily took action, he added in a separate speech. But after 19 fruitless months, the military has failed to safeguard the Amazon, a jungle larger than Western Europe that scientists consider a crucial buffer against changing climate. Government data show that deforestation last year surged to a 12-year high. Areas equal to 7 times the size of London were destroyed, and Operation Green Brazil has raised the white flag. Late last year, Vice President Hamilton Mourão, a retired Army general and Bolsonaro's deforestation czar, announced that efforts to protect the rainforest in April will revert to IBAMA, the civilian Environmental Protection Agency. The deployment had big-footed despite its history of success combating deforestation. The military deployment was part of the Bolsonaro toolkit. In his 2+ years in office, Bolsonaro has turned to soldiers to fill everything from cabinet posts to executive suites at state-run companies, to Brazil's troubled response to the coronavirus pandemic. The failure, according to environmental agents who accompanied soldiers during the deployment, was all but inevitable. The military, they argue, has neither the tools, the mentality, nor the structure to target and pursue those responsible for the destruction. Its primary objective, national defense, shares a few similarities with the law enforcement expertise and forestry know-how required deep in the jungle, they say. What's more, many in Brazil's military, as well as Bolsonaro himself, have historically called for developing the Amazon. They tout the rainforest's potential as a driver of economic growth and argue that developing the region can help keep covetous foreign powers from using its land, water, and minerals first. Early in the administration, another former general and top advisor to Bolsonaro, shocked many with a video in which he called for damming an Amazon tributary and extending a grain corridor toward Suriname. The project would have quintupled the human population of the northern Amazon, he said. Isabella Teixeira, a leftist and former environment minister, likened the environmental views espoused by Bolsonaro to those of the military dictatorship that sought to populate the Amazon 5 decades ago. The current Brazilian government has a 1970s mentality related to natural resources. Teixeira said that to control the forest means to cut it down. Bolsonaro thinks that is development. Spokespeople for Bolsonaro and the vice presidency referred inquiries for this story to the Defense Ministry. Vice Admiral Carlos Chagas, the ministry official authorized to speak about the deployment, told Reuters the mission to repel those destroying the jungle has been a success. Destruction in recent months has been slightly lower than a year earlier, although still near historic highs for a time of year when logging traditionally wanes. Operation Green Brazil is both a defense of the environment and the country's territorial integrity, he said. Environmental agents are suitable for routine enforcement of forestry laws, he explained, but the destruction and lawlessness got so bad that the heft and unifying power of the armed forces became necessary. Sovereignty means making sure the government of the people knows exactly what is going on inside its own territory, Chagas said in an interview. The presence of the military, he added, has always been a factor of unification and a factor keeping the country together. The ministry declined requests by Reuters over the past year to accompany troops on the deployment. For this report, the news agency interviewed dozens of government officials, Alabama agents, and others close to the deployment. Their previously unreported accounts, providing the most detailed look yet at the mission, portray a military both ill-prepared and reluctant for a task seen as increasingly urgent by scientists, environmentalists, and other governments worldwide. Environmental agents told Reuters that the unwieldy mobilization of soldiers slowed operations and curtailed their ability to catch wrongdoers. Instead of rapid raids with a few 4x4 vehicles and a handful of trained agents, outings with the military required big convoys of slow, heavy vehicles. Officers, agents added, nixed many of the ideas and tactics, like the destruction of logging equipment they usually employ to stop deforestation. For the people of Latin America's biggest, most populous country, the operation illustrates the limits of Bolsonaro's tough-talking approach to governing. Despite promises to restore law, order, and prosperity, Brazil remains racked by a feeble economy, high rates of violent crime, and the second highest COVID death toll in the world. The Amazon deployment, his opponents say, is one of many examples in which Bolsonaro's bombast obscures the lack of a real solution. The military taking over the Amazon is a strong image, said Marina Silva, another former environment minister, whose success in slashing deforestation earlier this century made her an icon of the global environmental movement, but in practice it's weakening enforcement, she said. Consider an operation last June that included surprise inspections of lumber yards in the eastern Amazonian state of Pará. Logging is illegal in some parts of the rainforest. A web of regulations defines what trees can be felled and where, but ensuring compliance is tricky. Loggers and sawmill operators often try to disguise unauthorized wood as legal. Soldiers, one Alabama agent told Reuters, didn't know what to look for. During one inspection, sawmillers sought to pass off piles of castanheira, a restricted species, as jequitiba, a wood that can be cut legally. I can identify it, the agent said, but a soldier can't. You need study and practical experience. The agent, like most other environmental officials who spoke with Reuters, asked not to be identified by name. His account was similar to those of 9 other agents from Alabama and ICM Bio, a sister agency that guards Brazil's natural parks. All 10 agents said the armed forces hindered more than helped their work. Chagas, the Defense Ministry official, recognized that soldiers could in fact lack the knowledge needed for environmental enforcement. They received this task, he said, and are doing the best they can. I don't know if I should maybe stop there because I think we've got another show after this, haven't we?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so basically, as an overall, it's very likely they've set the fires themselves, and then which has then justified them moving in the military and taking complete control of the Amazon. So it's almost as though their creation of a situation has allowed them the justification for them to basically turn the Amazon into almost a martial law state. And so it's another part of it, I suppose. They create the problems and then they present the solutions, which are agreed to in the light of situations with the fires, and almost along the lines of they had a funny mentality. Well, we don't want other foreign countries to take our resources, so we'll destroy them so they can't have them, but that also means we don't get them either. But of course, then that obviously impacts the average person far more so than the elites and the controllers. And so it's always the small person, so to speak, that suffers the most. So I'll just leave it there anyway.
Yeah, and both Bolsonaro and other leaders of the world, I mean, they're under pressure. They're not there by accident. The leaders, the presidents, they're placed there by the elites. And if they don't agree, then what happens is like what happened in Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, Eswatini, and Burundi, where they got rid of the leaders in terms of those leaders didn't agree to the COVID mandates. So these people representing the people in each country are, you got to understand, they're not there by election. They're chosen, placed there to do the will of the elites and the controllers. So this guy in Brazil is just following orders, basically. Okay, so thanks, Kevin. We'll see everybody next time for the World Forest Report. And we'll do the NUUU and say goodbye. Thank you. NUUU.